They said the boxer never lost control. Not in the ring, not in the streets, not even when men twice his size tried to take it from him. But on that night, in a crowded room filled with witnesses, he stepped forward with full confidence, and left without throwing a second punch. No one argued about who won. What they argued about was how it happened so quickly, and why the man who dominated everyone else suddenly chose not to continue. The answer was never announced. It was simply understood. The room did not announce itself. There was no sign outside, no schedule posted, no invitation openly extended. Those who entered had already heard of it through training partners, through quiet mentions after long sessions, through stories that were never fully explained. It existed in that uncertain space between rumor and routine. Inside, it was smaller than most expected. The floor carried the marks of repeated use, scuffed wood softened by years of footwork, subtle indentations where weight had shifted again and again. The air held a mixture of liniment and stillness, the kind that settles only in places where movement is constant but unnecessary noise is not. People gathered there without forming a crowd. They stood along the edges, leaning against walls, sitting when space allowed. No one positioned themselves at the center unless there was reason. Even then it was brief. The room did not belong to anyone in particular, but it also did not tolerate those who tried to claim it. Reputations arrived before the individuals did. A man might step through the door, and before he spoke, before he moved, others would already know something about him. Not everything, just enough. A record, a style, a past exchange. It was never discussed openly. There was no need. Recognition came in small glances, in the way space adjusted slightly to accommodate or to observe. There were no formal matches here, no rounds were timed, no scores were kept. What happened in the room stayed in the memory of those present, carried forward only through retelling, and even then details changed. Not intentionally, but because what mattered was not always what could be clearly described. What mattered was what could be felt. Some came to test themselves. Others came to confirm what they already believed. A few arrived with something quieter, curiosity without urgency, a willingness to observe without needing to prove anything immediately. These were the ones who stayed longest. There was an unspoken understanding that governed everything. No one explained it, but everyone recognized it when it was followed and when it was broken. Movements were controlled. Challenges, when they happened, were not announced loudly. They emerged through posture, through proximity, through a slight shift in tone or attention. A man might step forward, another might respond, and that was enough. Conversations in the room were short, often unfinished. Words were not the primary language here. They served only as a bridge between moments of action, not as a replacement for them. On certain evenings the room felt different, not louder, not more crowded, just more aware, as if something unspoken had already begun forming before anyone could identify it directly. People arrived in slightly higher numbers, though still within the quiet limits the space allowed. They positioned themselves more deliberately, leaving a clearer center, even if nothing had been declared. Those who had been there many times noticed it first. They did not comment. They simply adjusted, standing a little further back, watching a little more closely, as if anticipating something that did not yet exist. Newcomers sensed it too, though less clearly. They felt it in the way conversations shortened when certain individuals entered, in the way attention shifted without any visible signal, in the subtle change of posture from those who had nothing left to prove, yet chose to remain present. The room in those moments became something else. Not a place of training. Not entirely. It became a place where something could be revealed. Not forced, not demanded. Only revealed if the conditions were right. And on that particular evening, without announcement, without arrangement, those conditions were already forming. No one said it aloud, but those who understood the room knew something was about to be tested. He did not arrive quietly. The door opened with a certainty that did not match the room, and for a brief moment, conversation paused, not out of respect, but recognition. Those closest to the entrance turned first. The others followed more gradually, not wanting to appear overly attentive, but unwilling to ignore the shift. He stepped in without hesitation. His posture carried the habits of someone accustomed to being observed. Shoulders relaxed but deliberate. Chin slightly raised, not in defiance, but in assumption. He did not scan the room in curiosity. He looked through it, as if already certain of what it contained. Some of the men near the wall exchanged brief glances. They knew who he was, not by introduction, but by reputation. His record had traveled ahead of him, documented fights, decisive finishes, a style built on pressure and endurance. He was known for controlling distance, for closing space with intent, for overwhelming rather than outmaneuvering. In the ring, he did not wait. More importantly, he did not doubt. That certainty had carried him through opponents who relied on hesitation. It had worked often enough that it became part of him, not just a method, but an identity. When he stepped forward, others adjusted. When he set the pace, others followed or fell behind. Here, though, the room did not adjust in the same way. Space remained where it was. No one moved to greet him immediately. There was acknowledgement, but it was measured, contained. A few nods, nothing more, he noticed. Not outwardly, but in the slight pause before his next step. It was brief, almost unrecognizable, but it was there. The kind of pause that comes when expectation meets something unfamiliar. He moved further inside. "Is this where everyone tests themselves?" he asked, his voice steady, but carrying just enough volume to reach beyond the immediate circle. No one answered right away. It wasn't avoidance. It was timing. The room did not respond quickly to declarations. It allowed them to settle first. Finally, someone near the far wall spoke, sometimes. The response was simple, without invitation or challenge. The boxer gave a small nod, though it was unclear whether he accepted the answer or dismissed it. He rolled his shoulders once, loosening them out of habit more than necessity, then let his gaze move again. This time more carefully. He was measuring, not just size or stance, but presence. Who stood where? Who avoided attention? Who didn't need it? His eyes paused on a pair working quietly in the corner. Controlled movements, minimal sound. He watched for a moment, then looked away. It did not hold his interest. There was no resistance there, no visible test. He preferred something clearer. "You don't keep records?" he asked after a moment, directing the question to no one in particular. "No structure?" A few men exchanged faint smiles. Structure was not absent. It simply wasn't visible in ways he recognized. "What you do here," he continued, "how do you know who's better?" This time, the silence lasted longer. Not because the question was difficult, but because it didn't quite belong. It assumed something the room did not prioritize. Eventually, another voice answered, quieter than before. "You don't always need to." The boxer let out a short breath through his nose. Not quite a laugh, but close enough to carry its meaning. "That sounds convenient." There was no response to that. He took a step closer to the open space at the center, testing it with his presence. The floor beneath him responded the same way it did to everyone else, firm, unremarkable, uninterested in who stood on it. Still, he remained there for a moment, waiting, not for permission but for acknowledgement. It didn't come in the way he expected. No one challenged him directly. No one stepped forward to meet him simply because he had arrived. The room did not operate on invitation, and it did not react to pressure the way a ring might. For the first time since entering, his movement slowed slightly. It wasn't hesitation, not yet, but it was the beginning of something less certain. He turned his head again, scanning once more, but this time, looking for something specific. Someone who would respond in a language he understood. Someone who would step forward without needing to be asked. Because in his experience, there was always someone, and in a room like this, there had to be. He was already in the room, not at the center, not near the entrance. Off to the side, where the wall met the edge of the open floor. There was nothing about his position that invited attention, and yet, once noticed, it was difficult to look elsewhere for long. He had arrived earlier. No one had marked the moment. There had been no shift in the room when he entered, no pause in conversation. He had taken his place the same way he did everything else, without interruption, without declaration. Those who recognized him did not approach immediately. They acknowledged him the way the room preferred, quietly, without drawing focus. He returned the acknowledgement in the same manner. There was no need for more. While others moved through drills or low exchanges, he remained still for longer periods than most. Not inactive, but unoccupied in the visible sense. His attention rested somewhere between the movement in front of him and something less defined. When he did move, it was brief, precise adjustments, a short sequence practiced without repetition, then stillness again. Nothing was wasted. Across the room, the boxer noticed him. At first, it was not recognition, just a pause in observation, a slight narrowing of focus. Something about the stillness did not match the rest of the room. Everyone else, in one way or another, displayed effort through motion, through conversation, through subtle attempts to be seen or evaluated. This man did not. The boxer watched him longer than he had watched anyone else. There was no immediate conclusion to draw, no obvious stance to analyze, no pattern repeated long enough to define. Even his posture shifted without signaling intent, relaxed but never careless. Present, but not engaged in the way the others were. It created a kind of absence, not of ability but of display. The boxer stepped slightly closer, closing distance without fully committing to it. He expected, at the very least, a glance in return, some form of acknowledgement that he had entered that space, however informally. It did not come. The man remained as he was, not ignoring, simply not reacting. For a moment, the boxer stood there, measuring the lack of response. It was unfamiliar. In his world, attention followed presence. If not respect, then challenge. If not challenge, then avoidance. But never this absence of reaction. "You training?" the boxer said, his tone even, controlled, but directed clearly now. The man turned his head slightly, not fully, just enough. Their eyes met for a brief second, no longer than necessary to confirm awareness. "Yes," he said. The answer was quiet, without weight. It did not invite further conversation, nor did it close it. It simply existed. The boxer nodded once, as if acknowledging an expected exchange. "What style?" he asked. A simple question, but one that usually led somewhere. It created a frame, defined boundaries, allowed comparison. The man considered it, though not in any visible way. "No style," he replied after a moment. The boxer's expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough to register. "No style," he repeated, as if testing the phrase. There was no elaboration, no attempt to clarify or defend the answer. It stood on its own, without support. Around them, the room had begun to quiet, not completely, but enough that the shift could be felt. Conversation softened, movements slowed, attention adjusted, not directly toward them, but close enough to observe without appearing to. The boxer noticed he had felt rooms change before a fight, before an exchange. There was a familiar tension in those moments, something sharp, something anticipatory. This was different, this was steadier, less urgent. He studied the man again, more carefully now. There were no signs of strain, no visible readiness in the conventional sense, no tightening of stance, no adjustment of distance, just presence, unmoved, unforced. It created a question the boxer wasn't used to asking. Not can he fight, but how does he respond? "You spar?" the boxer asked, a little more direct this time. A pause. Then a small nod. "Yes, nothing more." The boxer shifted his weight slightly, testing the ground again, not physically, but in expectation. This was usually the point where something would begin. A gesture, a step forward, a mutual understanding forming without being spoken. It didn't happen. The man remained where he was, waiting, though not in the way the boxer expected. Not waiting for permission, not waiting for instruction, just waiting for something real, for a moment that did not need to be created. And in that stillness, something subtle began to shift, not in the room, but in the boxer's certainty. No one called for space, and yet it formed, not suddenly, not with urgency, but with a quiet understanding that something was about to happen. Those closest to the center adjusted their positions without looking at one another. A step back here, a slight turn of the shoulder there. The edges of the room widened just enough. The two men did not move toward the center together. The boxer stepped forward first. It was instinct. When presence is not acknowledged, it asserts itself. He placed himself where visibility was unavoidable, where any response, if it came, would have to meet him directly. The other man followed, but not immediately. He walked with no change in pace, no alteration in posture. There was no signal of readiness beyond his arrival. When he reached the open space, he did not square up in the conventional sense. His stance was present, but uncommitted, balanced, without declaration. The boxer noticed. He had seen hesitation before. This was not it. There was no tension to exploit, no gap that revealed uncertainty, just a kind of neutrality that did not offer anything to work against. "You ready?" the boxer asked. The question was routine, but the tone carried expectation. It assumed agreement, assumed progression. The man looked at him, a brief pause, then a small nod. That was enough. The boxer moved first. Not recklessly, not without control. His approach was measured, built on years of experience, closing distance with intention, testing reaction without overcommitting. His lead hand shifted slightly, not striking, but probing. A familiar rhythm designed to draw a response. It met nothing. Not absence, but non-engagement. The man did not retreat. He did not counter. He simply adjusted. A fraction of a step that changed the line without breaking it. The movement was small enough that it might have gone unnoticed if not for its effect. The boxer reset. He circled half a step, recalibrating angle and distance. Again he moved in, this time a little faster, a little closer. His hand came forward with more certainty, not a full strike, but no longer a test. This time, something happened. It did not begin where the observers expected. There was no visible wind up, no shift in stance that signaled intent. The man's movement emerged from stillness, direct, efficient, and already complete by the time it could be fully seen. A brief contact, not forceful, not extended, just enough. The boxer stopped. It wasn't a dramatic halt. There was no stumble, no visible loss of balance. But the forward motion ended, abruptly and completely. His arm, which had been in motion a moment before, no longer advanced. For a second, nothing followed. The man stepped back into the same neutral position he had started from. No follow-up, no continuation. The exchange had lasted less than a second. Around them, the room remained silent, not in shock, but in recognition. Those who had seen similar moments before understood what had occurred, even if they could not fully describe it. Those who had not were left with something less clear, but equally undeniable. The boxer blinked once, not in confusion, but in recalculation. He shifted his weight again, subtly checking his footing, his distance, his timing. Everything felt as it should, and yet something had already changed. He stepped forward again. This time, there was less probing, more intent. His movement carried a sharper edge, a decision to reassert control, to re-establish the rhythm he trusted. His hand came forward with greater commitment. The response was the same. Not identical, but equally brief, equally contained. A redirection, a touch that altered the line just enough. The boxer's strike did not land where it was meant to. It didn't land at all. Again, no follow-up. Again, stillness. The pattern did not escalate. It concluded itself. After the second exchange, the man lowered his hand slightly, not as a signal of ending, but as a return to where he had begun. There was no indication that he intended to continue, no invitation for another attempt. The boxer remained where he was. His posture had not collapsed. His stance was still intact, but something within it had shifted, not physically, but structurally. The certainty that had guided his movements a moment before was no longer as stable. He understood, at least in part, what had happened, not in detail, but in effect he had moved with intention, and that intention had not reached its target. Twice. The room did not react, no one spoke, no one stepped in. There was nothing to confirm, nothing to declare. The demonstration had not been announced, and it would not be explained. It had simply occurred, and in its brevity it had left something behind, not a victory, but a question that could not be answered through force. For a few seconds nothing moved. Not in the center, not along the edges. The room held its shape, as if unwilling to interrupt what had already been set in motion. The exchange had ended, but it had not concluded. Something remained unfinished, not in action, but in understanding. The boxer stood where he was. His stance was still correct. His balance had not failed him. There was no visible weakness to point to, no obvious mistake that could be isolated and corrected. And yet, he did not step forward again. Not immediately. His eyes remained on the man in front of him, searching not for an opening this time, but for an explanation. He replayed the brief moments in his mind, not consciously, but through instinct. Distance, timing, angle, these were things he had trusted for years. They had not responded the way they always did. He shifted his weight slightly. A subtle adjustment, almost imperceptible, but different from before. Earlier his movement had been assertive, built on expectation. Now, it carried a trace of uncertainty, not fear, but interruption. A break in continuity. He stepped forward again, slower, more deliberate. This time, there was no probing hand, no testing rhythm. He chose a direct approach, something simpler, something that had worked against opponents who complicated their own movement. a clean line, a decisive action. But even as he moved, something in him held back. Not enough to stop, but enough to delay. It was small, but it was there. The man in front of him did not change, no shift in stance, no visible preparation, the same neutral position, the same quiet presence. There was nothing to read and nothing offered to provoke. The boxer's strike began, and in that same moment it ended. Not through impact, but through absence. His arm extended, but not fully. His motion carried forward, but without conviction. Somewhere between intention and execution, something had interrupted the flow. He pulled back, not because he had been struck, but because he had not been certain. It was the first time. The room felt it. Not as a dramatic shift, but as a subtle change in weight, like something that had been held firmly was now slightly loosened. Those watching did not react outwardly, but their attention sharpened. The difference was small, but unmistakable. The boxer lowered his hand. Only slightly. Enough to rest, not enough to disengage. He exhaled once, steady, controlled. There was no outward sign of frustration, no visible acknowledgement of what had changed. But internally, the structure that had guided him, his rhythm, his certainty, was no longer intact in the same way. He looked again at the man before him. Not as an opponent now, but as something less defined, something that did not fit into the framework he relied on. "You're not countering," he said quietly. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation. The man met his gaze. For a moment there was no response. Then, simply, "There's nothing to counter." The words were calm, not dismissive, not confrontational, just precise. The boxer absorbed them. He did not argue. Because in that moment, he understood part of it. His attacks, if they could still be called that, were no longer fully formed. They lacked the commitment they once carried. And without that commitment, there was nothing to meet, nothing to redirect, nothing to finish. The exchange had already changed, not because of what had been done to him, but because of what had been removed. His certainty. He stepped back. Just one step. It was not a retreat in the traditional sense. There was no urgency, no loss of composure. But it created distance, physical, and something else beneath it. The man did not follow. He remained where he was, as he had been from the beginning, unmoved. The boxer stood there for a moment longer. Then he gave a small nod, not to concede defeat in any formal way. There had been no match, no agreement, no outcome to declare. But the nod carried acknowledgement not of loss, but of understanding. This would not continue. Not because it couldn't, but because continuing would not change what had already been revealed. He turned slightly, stepping out of the center without looking back. The space closed behind him in the same quiet way it had opened. No one stopped him. No one spoke. The room returned to itself, but not entirely as it had been. Something had shifted. Not in the man who remained, but in the one who had left the center, and more importantly, in how the others would remember it. No record was kept. There were no written accounts, no official statements, no footage preserved to confirm what had taken place. The room itself did not belong to any institution that would document its history. It existed, as it always had, in the memory of those who passed through it, and in the quiet continuity of its routine. Yet the story did not disappear. It moved slowly, from one practitioner to another, from teacher to student, not as a lesson that needed to be explained, but as an incident that resisted simplification. Each person who had been there carried a version of it, but the core remained unchanged. A boxer had entered with certainty, and left without resolution. In the years that followed, his name continued to circulate. He fought again. He won fights that were recorded, recognized, and measured in ways the room had never been. His skill did not vanish. His ability remained intact. To those who knew him only through official results, nothing seemed different. But among those who had shared that space with him, something had shifted. It appeared in small ways. In the way he approached distance, less abruptly, more considered. In the way he initiated exchanges, not with immediate assertion, but with a moment of observation. These were not weaknesses, they were adjustments. Subtle, but deliberate. He no longer assumed control. He established it, and even then, he held it more lightly. No one asked him directly about that evening. Not because it was forgotten, but because it did not belong to conversation. The room had never required explanation, and neither did what had happened within it. To speak of it openly would have reduced it, turned it into something definable, something that could be argued or dismissed. It was neither. It was understood in silence. As for the man who had remained, he continued as before. There were no visible changes in his behavior, no signs that the moment had held any particular significance for him. He trained, he observed. He moved with the same restraint, the same economy. Those who sought him out did so carefully, without expectation of instruction, without certainty of response. Sometimes he engaged, often he did not, and when he did it was never for long. The incident became part of something larger, not a defining event, but a confirming one. For those who had heard of his approach, his refusal to adopt rigid styles, his emphasis on directness, his disregard for unnecessary movement, it served as quiet evidence. Not proof in the formal sense, but reinforcement. It aligned with what they had been told. More importantly, it aligned with what they had seen. Over time, the details became less precise. Some remembered the exchange as lasting longer than it had. Others recalled movements that may not have occurred exactly as described. But these variations did not distort the meaning. If anything, they revealed something about the nature of the moment itself, that it could not be fully captured through description, only through impression. Years later, when the room had changed, when some of those who had stood along its edges no longer returned, when new faces replaced old ones, the story remained. Not always told in full, sometimes just referenced. A boxer once came in here, someone might say, and that would be enough. There was no need to name him, no need to identify the other man. Those who understood would recognize the reference. Those who didn't would hear it as just another fragment, another piece of an unstructured history. But occasionally, someone would ask, "What happened?" And the answer would come, not as a complete account, but as a careful recollection. He couldn't continue. Not because he was hurt, not because he was outmatched in the conventional sense, but because something he depended on had been quietly removed. And once removed, it could not be forced back into place. That was what remained. Not a victory, not a defeat, but a moment where the usual measures no longer applied. The room, in its quiet way, continued to hold that memory, not as a story to be retold for effect, but as a reminder. That control, when real, does not need to assert itself. It does not argue. It does not insist. It waits. And when the moment arrives, it reveals only what is necessary, nothing more, nothing less. The rest is left behind in silence.